Jim Simons was hands down the best trader in the world up until he died in May of 2024. He didn't have a background in finance, didn't draw squiggly lines on charts, and never listened to earnings calls. But he still managed to crush the market for more than 3 decades. His flagship medallion fund averaged about 66% a year before fees from 1988 to 2018. That's almost 3 times the average annual return of Warren Buffett's. Just so you understand how insane this is, if you invested $1,000 in medallion in 1988 and let it ride until today, it'd be worth $139 billion. Now that's not entirely true because they charge a bunch of fees, and after fees it would have only been a measly 195 mil. But that's not the point. What you should be asking is, how did a maths professor with no Wall Street cred build the most successful hedge fund of all time? And the answer's super simple. He used a shit ton of maths. Let me explain. Jim was not your typical hedge fund billionaire. He didn't have years of trading experience like George Soros or rich connections like Billy Ackman. He grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, fell in love with math, finished a PhD by 23, and taught at MIT and Harvard before running Stony Brook's math department. He was so good at maths that the NSA recruited him as a code breaker to create mathematical models that could spot patterns in Soviet spy messages and break their encryption. He did this for 4 years before he got sacked for speaking out against America's war in Vietnam, so he went back to teaching. But Jim always wanted to be rich. He had a wife and 3 kids and he wanted to give them the best life possible, but he couldn't do this on a teacher's salary. So like Walter White, he quit teaching, moved to New Mexico and started selling meth. Just kidding. At 40 in 1978, he quit academia and started a firm called ImmunoPrecise, which ended up being renamed 4 years later to Renaissance Technologies. Much better name, honestly. But anyways, unlike other hedge fund managers, Jim took a drastically different approach to trading. Rather than studying company earnings like Buffett or reading about geopolitical events like Dalio or Soros, Jim decided to treat the stock market like a maths problem and solve it. And after a few months of studying the markets and digging through a shit ton of data, he had his haha moment. Price movements weren't random. You gotta realize how revolutionary this is. There's entire books like A Random Walk Down Wall Street or Efficient Capital Markets that claimed market movements are essentially a coin flip and it's best to just buy and hold index funds. Not for Jimmy Simons though. He started noticing connections and patterns everywhere. Take this as a hypothetical example for the shit he'd notice. Say it rains more than usual in Brazil. This leads to soybeans getting cheaper, which means animal feed gets less expensive, and so farmers now have fatter cattle, ultimately leading to cattle futures climbing in coming months. And not only that, but the same oversupply of soy in Brazil might ding Argentina's exports and weaken the peso. One weather blip, multiple trade ideas. This was the holy fuck I'm gonna be a billionaire moment. Because Jim had already seen this movie before when he was code breaking. Find the patterns hiding in the noise. So instead of hiring finance bros, the kind of guys who only got their jobs by having rich parents, going to Wharton or Harvard, and being someone's coffee monkey and PowerPoint slave for 7 years at an investment bank, he went all in on maths, with the aim of building algorithms that could decode the millions of connections between real-world events and the stock market, effectively creating a system that could predict asset prices and market movements based on patterns humans couldn't even see or understand. This was the foundation of Renaissance Technologies, building the world's most advanced trading bot using data, statistics, and machine learning. Speaking of trading on the stock market, believe it or not, this video is sponsored on behalf of a publicly traded biotech company, ImmunoPrecise Antibodies. They're trading on the NASDAQ with the ticker IPA. Here's the deal. Drug discovery is broken. 90% of drugs fail. It's slow, expensive, and outdated. But IPA is flipping the script with AI. Their secret weapon is something called HYFT technology. Think of it like Google for biology. Instead of random trial and error, they can actually index life itself, making drug discovery explainable and traceable. On top of that, their Lens AI platform connects over 25 billion biological relationships, letting scientists design better drugs faster and even predict side effects before the lab work starts. Why does that matter? It means they can discover drugs faster, safer, and cheaper. And right now are using it to push forward new GLP-1 therapies for diabetes and metabolic diseases, one of the largest markets in medicine. They've got patents and partnerships that's already pushed their stock from 27 cents up to almost $3 in the last 6 months. Check the link in the description and the pinned comment to learn more. Now let's get back into the video. Jim was a genius, no doubt, but nobody cracks global markets alone. And so he started recruiting freakishly good mathematicians, statisticians, and computer scientists. But instead of hiring them as ordinary staff, he made them all partners. This way, everyone was aligned and worked harder to crack the code, because they all had skin in the game. One of the first heavy hitters was James Axe, who helped build the first version of the trading algo. They both knew that in order to accurately predict future price movements, their algo needed to analyze as much data as possible. And we're not just talking about stock price data. They collected weather reports, crop yields, currency movements, bond prices, interest rates, lumber costs, war records, rainfall data, anything that might even remotely affect the markets. And it all came from Jim Simon's theory that everything in the world was connected in ways humans couldn't see or comprehend. By 1988, they launched the Medallion Fund. Year 1 was meh, a 9% return when the S&P returned 16. And don't even start on year 2. The S&P returned 27.25%, while the Medallion Fund was down 3. Not even close to legendary status. Naturally, this led to tensions at Renaissance. Axe didn't want to change much and thought the algo needed more time to cook. Jim knew it was a piece of shit and wanted it reworked. Since Daddy Simons was the big boss, Axe packed his bags and left to start his own fund, Axcom. And there's a reason you've never heard of Axcom. It's because James Axe is an idiot. But anyway, this turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to Jim. With Axe gone, Jim brought in Elwyn Berlekamp, a game theory professor who took one look at the algorithm and immediately saw the problem. You're trying to hit home runs when you should be hitting singles. In other words, instead of trying to make big profits from a few large trades, focus on making tiny profits on millions of small trades. It was short horizon, high turnover quant trading done with ruthless statistical discipline. In the years that followed, they made 58% when the S&P lost 6.5. In 91, they did 39%, and in 94, they shocked the world with a 70% return while the S&P dropped 1%. Jim Simons was starting to become the big swinging math nerd of Wall Street. But big swinging dick wasn't enough for Jim. He wanted to be the biggest. So in 1993, he hired Robert Mercer and Peter Brown, computer scientists from IBM who specialized in predicting human speech. You know that thing where your phone suggests words to complete your sentence when you're texting? Yeah, these guys made that. And Jim wanted them to apply that same predictive logic to the financial markets. And so now, instead of programming fixed algorithms with specific encoded rules, Mercer and Brown introduced machine learning to their trading algos. The system could now teach itself new trading strategies by analyzing past patterns and therefore continuously improve its predictions. In 1995, after 2 years of coding, Robert and Peter had built the most sophisticated trading system ever created. Over 500,000 lines of code powered by machine learning algorithms that could predict market movements like they were completing sentences. And the results were mind-blowing. We're talking Lizzo-sized trading returns while the S&P was shitting itself. In 2000, during the dot-com crash, Medallion made 98%. 2008 global financial crisis, while banks were collapsing and hedge funds were shutting down, they made 82%. Jim had built the ultimate money printing machine. But there was a problem. See, when you're going for quick, small profits on millions of trades, you can't be placing those bets with too much money. Otherwise, you move the market yourself and ruin the inefficiency you're trying to exploit. Meaning they had to cap the Medallion Fund at somewhere around $8 to $10 billion. And so by 2005, the only people invested in the fund were employees of Renaissance. Of Renaissance's 275 employees, over 100 became worth more than $5 million. And every single person who worked there became a millionaire. They made so much money they bought an entire neighborhood of mansions in New York and called it the Renaissance Riviera. But ultimately, Jimmy Simons hit the biggest jackpot of them all. By the time he died in 2024, his net worth was $31.4 billion, making him the 55th richest person in the world and officially the greatest hedge fund manager who ever lived. He proved that with enough good maths, clean data, and a team of freakishly smart people, you can systematically exploit tiny edges over and over again, until the edge compounds into something unreal. What was the secret sauce? There wasn't. As Jim liked to say, it was a lot of little secrets. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.